The air over Europe burned with death. Every mission was a gamble, every breath a borrowed moment. The bombers of the United States 8th Air Force roared high above Germany, their engines echoing through thin clouds and heavy fear. Young men, barely out of their teens, sat inside metal coffins, surrounded by the endless hum of war. Their job was to deliver destruction from the sky, and hope they'd live long enough to see England again. Most didn't. By 1943, bomber crews were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Entire squadrons would take off at dawn and vanish by dusk. Families back home received telegrams faster than letters. In the icy skies over Europe, flak fire, the black clouds of exploding anti-aircraft shells, became the most feared killer of all. Each burst sent hundreds of razor-sharp steel fragments ripping through the thin fuselage of the bombers. The men had little protection. Their uniforms were designed for warmth, not survival. One piece of flying metal could end a life instantly. At the heart of this storm was one man who refused to accept death as routine. His name was Dr. Malcolm Grow, Chief Surgeon of the 8th Air Force. He wasn't a pilot nor a general, just a doctor trying to keep men alive. But what he saw every day broke him in ways words could not describe. His medical tents were filled with torn bodies, not from bullets, but from fragments, the cruel souvenirs of German flak. Legs shredded, torsos torn open, lungs punctured. Many of the wounded never made it to the operating table. Dr. Grow began to notice something important. The men dying from flak weren't always being hit directly. The fragments didn't need to pierce the heart or the skull. Sometimes they entered through the side, the abdomen, or the chest, and caused fatal internal bleeding. It wasn't the impact that killed them. It was the unstoppable bleeding that followed. Grow realized that if he could protect the most vulnerable parts of their bodies, the torso and the sides, he could save countless lives. But in wartime, ideas didn't always equal action. When he raised the issue with his superiors, the answer was always the same. Body armor was impractical for airmen. It would be too heavy, too restrictive, too costly. They said the men wouldn't wear it anyway. They told him to focus on treating the wounded, not preventing wounds. But Grow wasn't the kind of man to wait for permission. He decided he'd do it himself. In the quiet corners of the airfields, when bombers rested and medics cleaned the blood from stretchers, Grow began studying the fragments he pulled from his patients' bodies. He collected hundreds of pieces of shrapnel, jagged, uneven, each with a story written in pain. He examined their size, their shape, their speed. What he discovered changed everything. The fragments that were killing his men weren't moving at rifle speeds. They were slower, unpredictable, and scattered. Deadly, but not unstoppable. If he could create something light enough to wear in flight, but strong enough to stop low-velocity steel, he could reduce fatalities dramatically. It wasn't fantasy. It was physics. So without orders or funding, Dr. Grow began his secret mission. He reached out to a group of engineers from the Wilkinson Sword Company in England, the same company known for crafting blades and military steel. They were intrigued by his idea and agreed to help. Together, they started designing a protective vest made of lightweight manganese steel plates, sewn into a vest that could fit under the airmen's jackets. It wasn't meant to stop bullets. That was impossible at high altitude and speed. But it could block the kind of shrapnel that had been killing his men for months. It was an act of quiet rebellion. Grow knew that if his superiors found out, he could be reprimanded or even removed. But that didn't matter. He'd watched too many men die to care about paperwork. This wasn't about following rules. This was about saving lives. The first prototypes looked crude, a patchwork of steel and fabric, heavy but manageable. When he presented it to a few pilots, the reaction was mixed. Some laughed, calling it a tin shirt. Others shrugged, saying nothing could stop fate. But a few, the ones who'd seen friends torn apart by shrapnel, volunteered to try it. And so, without official approval, the first unauthorized flak vests took to the skies. The men wore them under their flight suits, not entirely sure if it would help, but knowing it couldn't hurt. When they returned from missions, Grow checked their injuries. The results were astonishing. One gunner came back with a dented steel plate right over his stomach. A piece of flak had struck it directly. Without the vest, that piece would have torn through him. Instead, he was alive, shaking but breathing. Grow documented every case. Each dented plate, each saved life, became proof that his vest worked. Slowly, word spread among the crews. They began to ask for the vests, calling them lifesavers. The laughter disappeared. Now, the men wanted protection. Grow's quiet defiance had turned into a revolution. He started pushing harder, convincing more crews to wear the vests, gathering more data, and sending his findings up the chain of command. At first, the brass still ignored him, until they couldn't. The numbers spoke for themselves. Crews equipped with Grow's vest were coming home alive at much higher rates than those without. The evidence was undeniable. The man who had been told it can't be done had proven it could. And yet, Dr. Grow's war was far from over. He still had to fight the military bureaucracy that distrusted innovation and punished disobedience. What he had done, building and distributing unauthorized equipment, could have ended his career. But when the results began saving hundreds of men, even his critics began to take notice. The secret project was about to become official. But for Grow, the victory wasn't about recognition or promotion. It was about seeing one less stretcher, hearing one less scream in the medical tents, and writing one less letter home to a mother who'd lost her son. That was his mission, and it had only just begun. Word spread quickly among the bomber crews stationed across England. Men who had laughed at the idea of wearing steel now waited outside the medical tents, asking for a vest before every mission. Pilots, navigators, and gunners who had once accepted death as inevitable began to feel something they hadn't felt in months: hope. For the first time, there was something between them and the flak, something that gave them a chance. Malcolm Grow watched the transformation quietly. He knew what was happening was more than just science. It was morale. He had seen despair in the men's eyes when they returned from missions, saw how the fear ate away at them with every flight. But now, that fear was fading. They believed in the vest, and belief in war was as powerful as any weapon. Still, Grow's work was far from over. His prototype vests were handmade, limited in number, and far from perfect. The steel plates sometimes shifted during missions, the straps were too tight, and the weight, though lighter than anyone thought possible, was still noticeable during long hours in the air. Grow needed to make it better, and he needed to make it fast. He began documenting every single detail: where each man wore the vest, what injuries were prevented, how much weight they could carry without losing mobility. He wrote everything down, sending detailed reports to his commanding officers. He didn't just want to save a few crews, he wanted every airman in the sky to have this protection. But even as the evidence piled up, military bureaucracy remained stubborn. Official orders still hadn't come. High-ranking officers continued to doubt that body armor was worth the effort. They called it a distraction, a comfort device, something that would make men overconfident and careless. But Grow knew better. Every dented plate he held in his hands was proof that he was right. He kept pushing, sending data, writing letters, making noise in a system that didn't like rebels. Behind closed doors, a few sympathetic officers began to take interest. They'd seen the casualty reports too, and they couldn't ignore the numbers. Crews equipped with Grow's vests were showing casualty reductions of more than 50%. Missions that once ended in tragedy were now bringing men home. That kind of result couldn't be argued with for long. While the upper ranks debated, the men on the ground kept wearing the vests, whether officially issued or not. Many of them even pooled their own money to have copies made by local workshops. British mechanics and armorers began improvising versions of Grow's design, cutting steel plates by hand, stitching them into canvas. It wasn't about following orders anymore. It was about survival. Meanwhile, Grow continued to refine the design. He worked with the Wilkinson sword engineers to make the steel plates thinner but stronger, experimenting with manganese alloys that could absorb impact without breaking. The goal was simple: maximum protection, minimum weight. The new versions fit better, moved with the body, and didn't restrict the airmen as much in their cramped bomber compartments. Every improvement was tested, not in laboratories, but in the sky. The battlefield became the proving ground. Each mission provided data. Each returned crew another step toward perfection. Grow would examine every vest after flight, counting the impacts, recording how deeply the steel had dented. Some plates had stopped fragments the size of a coin. Others showed gashes where molten steel had flattened against them instead of piercing through. To anyone else, those plates were damaged scrap metal. To Grow, they were evidence of victory. One afternoon, a waste gunner was brought into the medical station after a brutal mission over Bremen. His plane had taken a direct hit from flak, shredding the fuselage. When medics cut away his jacket, they found the steel vest dented in multiple places. Some almost punched through, but beneath it, the gunner had only bruises. Grow stared at the vest in silence for a long time before saying softly, "That's one more life the steel bought us." The psychological impact of the vest was just as important as the physical one. Airmen began personalizing them, painting names or slogans on the inside, treating them like lucky charms. One crew even named theirs Grow's Guardian. The vest became a silent symbol of defiance, a reminder that even in the face of death, they had a chance to fight back. But in war, success often breeds attention, and attention brings scrutiny. Word of Grow's unauthorized program reached higher headquarters. Some officers demanded an investigation. Who gave him permission to alter standard issue equipment? Who authorized the production of unapproved armor? For a time, Grow was called into briefings to defend himself. He explained the science, showed the data, the numbers, the saved lives. But what truly silenced the critics were the men themselves. Pilots and crew members wrote letters, testimonies describing how the vest had saved them. They told stories of shrapnel hitting their chest mid-mission, of steel plates dented inches from their hearts. Grow collected those letters and presented them to his superiors. They weren't technical reports, they were human proof. No general could ignore the words of men who lived because of that steel. Finally, after months of resistance, the U.S. Army Air Forces gave in. In late 1943, Dr. Malcolm Grove's design was approved for official production. It was renamed the M1 flak vest. Factories across Britain began producing thousands of them. By early 1944, bomber crews all over Europe were being issued the armor before missions. The vest that had started as an unauthorized experiment was now standard equipment. Grove's quiet rebellion had turned into a movement that reshaped air warfare. Casualty rates among bomber crews began to drop. The number of fatal flak injuries fell dramatically. Airmen started to believe they might survive 25 missions, a milestone that once felt like a death sentence. The morale boost was enormous. Commanders who had once dismissed Grove's idea now praised it in briefings. The man who had been questioned for disobedience was now being recognized for innovation. Yet Grove himself remained humble. He rarely spoke about his achievement publicly. For him, it wasn't about fame or promotion. It was about doing what was right. In his quiet office, he would often sit surrounded by dented steel plates, each one representing a man who had come home alive. They were more than pieces of metal. They were lives preserved through defiance, persistence, and compassion. As 1944 wore on, and the Allies pushed deeper into occupied Europe, Grove's vest became an inseparable part of bomber life. From the frozen skies over Berlin to the firestorms above Hamburg, men flew with a new kind of confidence. They still faced death every day, but now they did it wearing proof that someone cared enough to protect them. Dr. Malcolm Grove had changed the course of aerial warfare, not by designing a new weapon, but by giving men the power to survive. The sky above Europe was still deadly, but something had changed. The bomber crews of the 8th Air Force now climbed into their planes wearing a layer of steel between themselves and oblivion. The first official shipments of flak vests had arrived, stamped and numbered by order of the United States Army Air Forces. The idea that once earned Malcolm Grove quiet warnings and raised eyebrows was now policy. When the vest became standard issue, Grove didn't celebrate. He went right back to work, refining the design again and again. Every improvement meant more lives saved. The manganese steel plates were rearranged to cover the lower abdomen and groin, areas that previous versions left exposed. The canvas shell was replaced with a tougher, fire-resistant fabric. New versions weighed just over 20 pounds, still heavy, but manageable even during long missions. Crews called them Grove suits, though the official name was the M1 flak vest. For the airmen, the vest became a ritual. Before every takeoff, they'd pat the steel panels as if checking that luck was still on their side. In freezing hangars, they strapped them on while joking nervously about who'd need them most that day. Inside the bombers, the vests clanked softly as men moved through the narrow fuselage. A metallic rhythm blending with the drone of engines. Statistics began to tell the story that words could not. Reports from the medical corps showed fatal torso wounds dropping by more than half. Pilots and gunners who would have bled out before reaching the runway were now walking away with bruises instead of funerals. Grove received letters from field surgeons across England, thanking him for making their work less tragic. "Your armor has changed the face of our casualty lists," one wrote. "For once, I'm stitching up survivors instead of closing their eyes." Despite the success, Grove faced new challenges. Production couldn't keep up with demand. Every bomber group wanted vests for all crew positions, but factories struggled to supply them fast enough. Steel was already scarce, needed for tanks, ships, and artillery. Grow had to argue that saving airmen was as important as building more weapons. "A living man can fight again," he told procurement officers. "A dead one cannot." His persistence worked. Within months, the M1 flak vest became a priority item. The difference it made was visible, not just in statistics, but in spirit. Crews that once approached missions like doomed men now cracked jokes before flight. The belief that survival was possible changed the way they fought. They stayed focused longer, fired their guns more accurately, and took risks that brought missions to success. Psychologists attached to the Air Force noticed lower levels of combat fatigue among crews wearing the vest. Grow's armor had done something medicine rarely achieved. It healed fear. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe were filled with thousands of bombers heading for targets deep inside Nazi territory. Each man carried the weight of war on his shoulders, and the weight of Grow's steel across his chest. During the raids on Berlin, when enemy flak was so thick, pilots said you could walk on it, the vests proved their worth again and again. Crews returned with shattered glass, torn metal, and steel plates so dented they looked like crumpled tin, but the men beneath them lived. One gunner wrote home after a particularly brutal mission, "They hit us head-on. I felt a punch in my belly and thought I was done for. But when we landed, I saw the dent in the vest. That piece of steel caught it for me. Tell Mom that a doctor I never met saved my life." Letters like that made their way back to Grow, who kept them in a drawer. He never showed them to the press, never asked for fame. He just kept them as quiet reminders of why he'd broken the rules. Grow's innovation also influenced Allied partners. British and Canadian Air Forces began adopting similar vests for their crews. The Royal Air Force called them flak suits, modeled almost exactly on Grow's design. Even Soviet engineers heard about the concept and experimented with steel chest plates for their own airmen. The idea had spread far beyond the small group of men who first tested it in secrecy. Inside the 8th Air Force, Grow's reputation grew with each returning crew. He wasn't just a surgeon anymore. He was a legend. Men who never met him spoke his name with reverence, as if he were a guardian watching over them. They painted slogans on their vests. "In Grow we trust," "Flak-proof," "Dr. Steele." To them, he wasn't a distant officer. He was the reason they still breathed. But war never stands still, and neither did Grow. He began exploring ways to extend the protection beyond the air. Could ground troops benefit from lighter versions? Could medics in the field wear armor that wouldn't slow them down? He was already thinking ahead to the wars no one wanted to imagine. His research notes show sketches for flexible armor made from overlapping metal plates and new synthetic fibers. Ideas that would later shape the future of body protection. In July 1944, Grow was summoned to a briefing with senior commanders. He expected another round of questions or criticism. But this time, the meeting ended differently. The commanding general of the 8th Air Force handed him a citation for meritorious service. "You've saved more of my men than any weapon we've deployed," the general said simply. Grow accepted the honor with quiet dignity, knowing that the real reward was outside, sitting on runways, preparing for another mission. By late 1944, the tide of war had turned. Allied air superiority was overwhelming. Bombers flew deeper into Germany, destroying its war machine piece by piece. And through all those missions, The flak vest remained a constant companion. When the war finally ended in 1945, thousands of men owed their lives to a piece of steel and the stubborn doctor who refused to accept no for an answer. When the casualty numbers were tallied after the war, the results stunned even the skeptics. More than 20,000 airmen were estimated to have survived wounds that would have been fatal without body armor. The M1 flak vest had saved not hundreds, but thousands. It had turned one man's defiance into a legacy of life. For Grow, the war's end was bittersweet. He had accomplished what he set out to do, but the memories of the wounded never left him. He once wrote in a private letter, "Each dent in those plates is a soul spared, but for every plate without a dent, I remember the ones I couldn't save." The war had taken its toll on him too. Still, his invention had proven that compassion could be as powerful as command, and that innovation could rise even from the darkest corners of war. By the time the Allied flags flew over Berlin, the name Malcolm Grow was known throughout the Air Force. His quiet rebellion had rewritten military medicine. The flak vest became the foundation for every modern piece of body armor that followed. Soldiers, police officers, and medics across decades would owe part of their safety to a surgeon who refused to stay in his lane. Yet when journalists later tried to interview him about the invention, Grow simply said, "Wasn't unauthorized. It was necessary." When the war ended, the world celebrated the heroes who flew, fought, and fell. But few outside the Air Force knew about the quiet surgeon who had saved thousands without ever firing a shot. Dr. Malcolm Grow returned home not to fanfare, but to more work. The war might have been over, but the lessons it taught him about courage, innovation, and sacrifice would echo for the rest of his life. The bombers that once filled the skies over Germany were grounded now, silent in their hangars. Crews who had survived the flak and fire came home, carrying their battered steel vests as mementos. Many of them sent letters to Grow, sometimes with photographs of the vests that had saved them. One airman wrote, "I kept it with me through 30 missions. It's dented and burned, but so am I. And we both made it home." Grow kept those letters in a box, each one a reminder that disobedience in the name of compassion had been worth every risk. He had never sought glory, but recognition found him anyway. The United States Army Air Forces awarded him the Legion of Merit for his groundbreaking work in developing body armor. Later, he received the Distinguished Service Medal, the highest non-combat honor the Air Force could give. Yet even as the medals were pinned to his chest, Grow's expression stayed modest, almost distant. To him, the only real reward was seeing men live to grow old, raise families, and tell stories that might have ended in silence. After the war, the Air Force was reorganized as a separate branch of the U.S. military. When that happened, in 1947, Dr. Malcolm Grow was appointed as the very first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force. It was a historic moment, but he treated it as another opportunity to serve rather than a promotion to celebrate. His new mission was to apply everything he had learned in the skies of Europe to protect future generations of airmen. He oversaw the creation of new medical training programs, advanced evacuation systems, and protective gear that built on his wartime work. Under his leadership, the Air Force became a pioneer in flight medicine, trauma care, and physiological research. But Grow's heart always returned to the same principle that guided him during the war. Innovation born from necessity. He often reminded young doctors and officers that saving lives sometimes meant challenging authority. He told them, "If you see suffering and have the means to stop it, you do not wait for permission, you act." Those words, simple but powerful, became part of Air Force medical doctrine for decades. Meanwhile, the vest itself evolved. Engineers refined Gro's design into new generations of body armor. The lessons learned from the flak vest inspired the M1951 and later the M69 flak jackets used during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. With each conflict, the armor grew lighter, stronger, and more flexible. Eventually, research into synthetic materials like Kevlar and ceramics brought protection to soldiers on the ground and airmen in the sky that far surpassed what Gro could have imagined. Yet every modern vest, every soldier who straps on armor before stepping into danger, owes something to that first, unauthorized experiment. In time, Gro's invention also found a home beyond the battlefield. Police officers, rescue workers, and even journalists in war zones began wearing protective vests modeled on the same concept. The world had learned from a surgeon who refused to accept that casualties were inevitable. His defiance had rewritten what it meant to protect those who serve. Though the war had ended, Gro carried its memories quietly. Friends who visited him in later years said he rarely spoke about his achievements. Instead, he talked about the men he had lost, the young faces, the laughter in the barracks, the long nights after missions when the stretchers kept coming. He never forgot them. In one rare interview near the end of his life, he said softly, "They called it unauthorized. I called it duty. I did what I would want someone to do for me, if I were up there instead of down here." He lived long enough to see the seeds of his work take root in every corner of modern warfare. The Air Force named its medical center in Maryland after him, the Malcolm Gro Medical Clinics and Surgery Center, a lasting tribute to his vision. Generations of flight surgeons and medics would pass through its halls, many unaware that the man whose name hung above the doors had once risked his career to save men he'd never even met. In the decades that followed, military historians began to rediscover his story. At first, he was just a footnote in the long history of World War II. But as researchers looked deeper, they realized how profoundly his work had changed the course of the air war. Without his vest, casualty rates among bomber crews might have remained catastrophic. The air campaigns over Germany, already one of the deadliest undertakings in military history, could have cost tens of thousands more lives. His armor didn't just save individuals. It helped sustain the bombing missions that crippled the Nazi war machine and brought the conflict to an end sooner. In a quiet, uncelebrated way, his contribution had been strategic as well as humanitarian. As the world moved into the jet age and new wars arose, the principles Gro fought for remained timeless. Protection was no longer seen as optional or impractical. It was essential. His defiance during World War II had set a precedent, that innovation and compassion often come from those who refuse to wait for orders. In his later years, Gro spent time visiting veterans' hospitals. Sometimes, former airmen would recognize him and approach, offering a handshake or a salute. Many of them brought old, dented flak plates, kept as personal relics. They'd hand them to him with quiet gratitude, saying, "This one stopped a piece of Germany for me." Gro would smile and answer, "Then it did its job." He passed away in 1960, leaving behind a legacy written not in bloodshed, but in survival. The generation he helped protect grew old and told their grandchildren stories of courage, friendship, and the sky that nearly swallowed them whole. Somewhere in those stories, his name lived on, carried by every man who made it home because of a doctor who broke the rules. Today, his invention is often overshadowed by the machines of war, the bombers, the guns, the generals, but its impact remains immense. The steel vest was not glamorous. It didn't win medals in the sky or appear in newsreels. It simply did its job. It saved lives. And in doing so, it redefined what heroism could look like. Not every hero leads a charge or pulls a trigger. Some work in silence, behind the scenes, building hope out of metal and compassion. If you walk through an Air Force museum today, you might see one of those original vests. Its canvas faded, its plates rusted with time. To most visitors, it's just another artifact of a distant war. But to those who know the story, it's something far greater. Each dent, each scar in the steel is a testament to a life spared. It's proof that even in the darkest hours of history, humanity can find ways to protect itself, not through destruction, but through care. And somewhere above those same skies where death once reigned, you can almost imagine the echo of engines fading into peace, carried by the memory of a surgeon who dared to save lives when everyone else accepted loss. Dr. Malcolm Grow never wore a pilot's wings, but he gave them to others. And because of that, thousands of men who might have died in the frozen skies over Europe came home to live their lives, raise families, and remember the doctor who refused to let them die for nothing. He changed the course of war, not with a weapon, but with an act of mercy. And in doing so, he reminded the world that true heroism doesn't always make headlines. It makes survivors.